There is a city in the Blue Ridge Mountains where the buildings stopped aging in 1930. Walk through downtown Asheville, North Carolina today, and in a strange way, you are walking through a photograph. The terracotta roof of the Art Deco City Hall glows pink and green against the ridgelines. The slender Gothic tower of the Jackson Building rises over Pack Square the way it has for 100 years. The grand stone facades along Patton Avenue still wear the ornament of an age that ended long ago. For a few short and dazzling years, this was the most luxurious mountain retreat in America. The playground of Vanderbilts and self-made millionaires. A place they called the Paris of the South. And then, a single decision, made out of something close to pride, took all of that promise and buried it. It would take this city nearly 50 years to climb out of the grave it dug for itself. Half a century of poverty, of silence, of construction that simply stopped. This is the story of the choice that froze Asheville in time, and how the wound it left behind slowly, quietly, became the most beautiful thing about it. To understand how a city falls this far, you first have to understand how high it had climbed. In the closing years of the 1800s, the railroads found their way into these mountains, and the mountains began to fill with money. The cool air and the clean water drew the sick and the wealthy in equal measure, and at the center of it all stood a single house. George Washington Vanderbilt, heir to one of the great fortunes of the age, chose this remote valley to build himself a home. He named it Biltmore. With 250 rooms, it remains the largest privately owned house ever built in America. A French Renaissance chateau dropped impossibly into the southern Appalachians. When it was finished, the artisans and stone carvers who had built it did not leave. They stayed, and they kept building, and slowly they remade the city in their own elegant image. Then came the hotels. The Grove Park Inn opened its doors in 1913. A vast lodge of native granite boulders, some of them weighing 5 tons, hauled down the mountainside by trains of wagons. It became a refuge for presidents and writers and the very rich, the kind of place where the world came to rest. By then, the secret was out. Asheville was no longer a sleepy mountain town. It was a destination. The numbers tell the rest. In 1920, around 20,000 people called Asheville home. By 1930, that figure had more than doubled to 50,000, making it one of the largest cities in all of North Carolina. And on top of those residents, roughly 200,000 tourists were arriving every single year, pouring their money into the hotels, the shops, and above all, the land. Because when a town gets this hot, people stopped seeing streets and start seeing fortunes. Speculators swept in and began trading land the way others traded stocks. A man would buy a parcel, or simply an option on a parcel, and sell it weeks later for a profit he had done nothing to earn. Entire new neighborhoods appeared almost overnight, and rising above the speculation came the buildings, the ones that still define the skyline today. The first of them belonged to a young man named Linwood Jackson. He was only 28 years old, a real estate developer who believed in this city with the fervor of a true believer, and he wanted to make a statement that no one could ignore. So in 1924, on a plot of land just 27 feet wide and 60 feet deep, a lot most people considered far too small to build anything on, he raised a skyscraper. 13 stories of Gothic stone climbing toward the clouds, the first skyscraper in all of western North Carolina. He fitted it with a searchlight that threw a beam 30 miles across the mountains. He built it, in his own words, to proclaim that he and Asheville had arrived. He was not alone in his certainty. More than 65 new buildings went up downtown during that single decade. The city commissioned a new city hall from the architect Douglas Ellington, a man trained in Paris, and what he gave them was extraordinary. An Art Deco masterpiece crowned with an octagonal roof of pink and green tile, its silhouette deliberately shaped to echo the mountains behind it. The very same year, 1928, the county raised its own grand courthouse beside it. Two monuments to two visions of the future, standing shoulder to shoulder on the square. But monuments are not free, and this is where the seeds of the tragedy were quietly being sown. To build a modern city, Asheville borrowed. Its leaders looked at the growth, at the tourists, at the speculators, and they made a reasonable bet that it would never end. One mayor authorized more than $15 million in spending on water lines, paved roads, and civic grandeur, a fortune for a city this size. A later study would gently note that some of these projects, like the city's new public golf course, were less necessities than luxuries. Yet the city was not the only one borrowing. The surrounding districts, places like Biltmore Village and Swannanoa, were each allowed to issue their own debt without ever telling one another. They borrowed for the same roads twice. They spent against the same bright future again and again. It is tempting, looking back, to call this arrogance. But it was something more human than that, and therefore sadder. It was faith. A whole city had simply decided that it could not fail. For a while, nothing happened to suggest otherwise, and that is always how it goes. The first crack appeared so quietly that almost no one noticed. As early as 1922, the city's tax collections had begun to slip. Then, in 1926, 3 years before the rest of the country would feel any pain at all, the Asheville real estate market began to cool. The speculators who had bought land expecting endless buyers suddenly found the buyers had vanished. Prices that had only ever climbed began, for the first time, to fall. Between 1927 and 1933, the price of a home in Asheville would drop by nearly half. The warning could not have been clearer. The engine of the boom, the land itself, was sputtering. And yet the city kept building, kept borrowing, kept paying for a future that was already slipping out of reach. By 1928, more than half of every dollar the city collected in revenue was going to nothing but the interest on its debts. By the following year, the city and the county together had taken on more than $56 million in bonded debt. They had mortgaged the whole of tomorrow. They only needed tomorrow to arrive on schedule. It did not. In October of 1929, the stock market in New York collapsed, and the long nightmare of the Great Depression descended on the country. For most American cities, the worst came slowly, in waves over the following years. But Asheville, already weakened, already overextended, had its reckoning compressed into a single catastrophic day. The trouble arrived from the west. A sprawling financial empire built around a Tennessee firm called Caldwell and Company began to crumble, and as it fell, it pulled down bank after bank across the South. Asheville's own central bank and trust company was tied into that failing network through its dealings, and the panic spread like fire through dry grass. On November the 20th, 1930, it happened. In the span of that one morning, 8 banks across the region locked their doors and never opened them again. 4 of them were in Asheville itself. People still call it the city's Black Wednesday, and it broke something that would not be mended for 2 generations. At the center of the wreckage stood the Central Bank and Trust. It had not been just any bank. It had held the public's money, the city's money, the county's money, the money set aside for the schools. When it died, it took those deposits with it. The city alone lost more than $4 million in public funds. Counting the county and the schools together, the figure was closer to $8 million. In a single morning, the savings of an entire community simply ceased to exist. And here the story stops being about ledgers and bonds and becomes about a man. His name was Edward Gallatin Roberts, though everyone knew him as Gallatin. He was the mayor of Asheville, and he was, by every account, a deeply honorable person. He had grown up poor and fatherless, and he had spent his entire life trying to become the upright, trustworthy man he wished his absent father had been. He had served this city for decades as county attorney, as a state legislator, as mayor not once but twice. He had fought for the secret ballot and for the right of women to vote. His own campaign had called his character unimpeachable. He had also sat on the board of the Central Bank and Trust. When the bank failed and the public's millions vanished, the people demanded to know how. Investigations followed. Audits were ordered, and they were damning, revealing years of gross mismanagement of an outside accounting firm that had turned the city's books into what one report called a monumental farce. In February of 1931, a grand jury handed down indictments. 6 public officials and 11 bankers were charged with conspiring to misuse the public's money. Among the 6 was Gallatin Roberts. He had already resigned the office he loved. Now he stood accused of betraying the very trust he had built his life upon, and he insisted to anyone who would listen that he was innocent. The newspaper itself had concluded that no local official had personally pocketed a single dollar, but the accusation alone was more than he could carry. On the 25th of February, 1931, after quietly setting his affairs in order, Gallatin Roberts took his own life in his law office above the very bank that had ruined him. He left behind 3 letters, one for his closest friend, one for his family, and one for the people of Asheville, which the newspaper printed in full. In it, he wrote of finding the people's money already in that bank when he took office, and of trying with all his soul to protect it. And then he asked them a question that still hangs over the city almost a century later. What would you have done? The final words of his letter were these: "My soul is sensitive," he wrote, "and it has been wounded unto death. Thousands came to his funeral, and the city he left behind now faced a decision that would define it for the next 50 years. Across America, in the depths of the Depression, hundreds of towns and cities found themselves drowning in debt they could no longer pay, and most of them did the only sensible thing. They defaulted. They went to their creditors. They declared that they simply could not pay, and they walked away from the burden so that they might survive. There was no shame in it. It was survival. Asheville was given that same door, and Asheville refused to walk through it. The matter went all the way to the federal courts, and the ruling, handed down by Judge Webb, became in a strange way a kind of tribute to the dead mayor. The court found that the city's borrowed millions had not been stolen or squandered for personal gain. They had been spent on real things, on water systems and roads and public buildings that still stood and still served the people every day. The city had received the benefit of that money. Therefore, the court concluded the city was bound to pay it back. And so, in January of 1936, the people of Asheville made their choice formal. In a sweeping settlement, the city agreed to assume the entire debt, not only its own, but the tangled obligations of its districts and of Buncombe County as well. All of it would be repaid in full, with interest, on a strict and unforgiving schedule. Every cent. It is difficult now to convey the size of what they had agreed to shoulder. By 1932, the people of Buncombe County owed their bondholders the equivalent of nearly $3 billion in today's money, spread across the county's 98,000 residents that came to more than $28,000 owed by every single man, woman, and child. It was, by some measures, the highest per capita municipal debt of any city in the entire nation, and the people who would pay most of it had, in many cases, been children when the money was spent. they would settle a bill for a party they had never been invited to. Historians who study that era say something remarkable about the decision. As far as anyone can tell, Asheville may be the only city in all of American history to repay its Great Depression debt in full rather than default. It was, depending on how you look at it, the noblest thing the city ever did, or the most ruinous. In truth, it was both, because what followed was not recovery. What followed was a long gray winter that lasted for decades. To make those payments, year after year after year, the city had to starve itself. Budgets were slashed to the bone. Public services were cut back and cut back again. There was no money for parks, no money for expansion, and above all, no money to build. The cranes that had filled the skyline in the 20s fell silent and stayed silent. While other American cities grew and modernized through the 1940s and 50s, Asheville simply held still, sending its money away to distant bondholders. The proud towers of the boom became something else now. The Jackson Building, that gleaming symbol of a young man's faith in his city, became instead a symbol of everything that faith had cost. The grand facades along the streets grew shabby. Owners who could not afford true repairs simply nailed cheap sheets of metal over the beautiful old fronts, hiding the ornament behind something plain and cheap and forgettable. The city did not tear its past down. It could not afford to. So it covered it up, and it waited. A generation grew up in that waiting. They knew Asheville not as the Paris of the South, but as a place that money had abandoned, a place where the buildings were too old and the future was on permanent hold. The dream of a city of 500,000 people, the dream the planners had genuinely believed in, faded into something almost unbearable to remember. And still, every year, the payments went out. Through the Depression, through a world war, through the prosperous decades that lifted nearly every other American city while leaving this one behind. The final payment was made on the 1st of July, 1976, nearly half a century after the banks had failed. On the country's 200th birthday, Asheville at last paid off the last of its debt. The shackles, as one writer put it, were finally loosed. The men and women who signed that decision back in 1936 were almost all gone. They had kept a promise that would outlive them by decades. And here is where the story turns, and where the sorrow gives way to something stranger and more beautiful. In those same decades that Asheville spent frozen and broke, a wave swept across the rest of urban America. They called it urban renewal. Flush with federal money, cities everywhere set about demolishing their old downtowns, swinging the wrecking ball through block after block of 19th and early 20th century architecture to make way for parking lots and concrete towers. Across the country, the elegant old hearts of 1,000 cities were erased forever in the name of progress. But Asheville had no money for progress. It could not afford the wrecking balls. It could not afford to clear its old buildings and start over, because every spare dollar was already promised to a bondholder somewhere far away. And so, while other downtowns were being torn down and rebuilt into something interchangeable, Asheville's was simply left alone. The cheap metal came off the facades eventually, and underneath, almost untouched, were the buildings of the boom. The Art Deco City Hall with its mountain crown, the Gothic spire of the Jackson Building. Around 170 structures in all, one of the most complete collections of early 20th century commercial architecture anywhere in the region, preserved not by foresight, not by love, but by simple, grinding poverty. The thing that destroyed the city is the same thing that saved its soul. There is a hard and humbling lesson buried in that. The people of the 1920s believed they were building monuments to their own triumph, and instead, they built the instrument of their downfall. The people who paid for that mistake believed they were buying nothing but pain, and instead, without ever knowing it, they were preserving a treasure for grandchildren they would never meet. None of it was planned. The beauty of Asheville today is the residue of a wound that never fully healed in time. Walk those streets now, and the city is alive again, prosperous and crowded and admired. The visitors have returned, drawn by the very thing the long winter accidentally protected, and almost none of them know that the charm they have come to see was paid for in 50 years of silence, and in the life of an honorable man who could not survive the shame of a collapse he tried to prevent. If stories like this one move you, the ones where a single choice echoes across a century, consider following along, because history is full of these quiet, devastating turns, and they deserve to be remembered. Asheville stands today as something rare. Not a city that conquered its tragedy, and not a city that was destroyed by it, but a city that was shaped by it permanently into the very thing we now find beautiful. Its grand old buildings are not really monuments to wealth or to ambition or even to pride. They are monuments to a mistake and to the stubborn, sorrowful refusal of an entire city to walk away from it.